great if you could just look at their bios, and I am going to begin by introducing Gregory Maniakis, who's the Senior European Policy Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute and the advisor to the United Nations Special Representative on Migration and Development. Gregory, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Does this work? I just talk from here.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Jenny and Columbia University and UN Women for having me. I am, disclaimer, not a specialist on gender and migration, so I will defer to others when it comes to the specific implications of migration for women, which are in some ways well known. Women now make up about half of migrants, international migrants. They tend to be in especially vulnerable positions in domestic work, for instance, where they are not in sight, essentially, and have often very little recourse when things go badly. And their departures from their families and communities have especially significant impacts. I'm not going to talk about all that. I want to tell you a story of how cooperation on international migration has evolved over the past decade and how it looks from here on out. And I think from that story, there's one message in particular that I think is worth recognizing and that I think will resonate in this room. So let me tell you about the big picture. Today there's about 232 million people who have migrated every year across borders. That's the official UN number. I think the unofficial number is significantly bigger because the UN number is constrained by various parameters, like you are only a migrant if you've left for a year or more. So you're talking about roughly 250 million people who are living outside their countries of birth right now. It's a much bigger number if you take into consideration how many people alive today who will move and how many people alive today have in the past been a migrant, first and second generation migrants. Tally all those up, we're talking about 1 billion people. That's just off the top of my head. But it's not wrong in terms of its scale of magnitude. And then you think of the families that are left behind in the first and second generation, and you're talking about migration as a much bigger phenomenon than 232 million official figure might seem to indicate. You have more people than ever moving today. You have fewer legal options for doing so. And it's that imbalance between the demand and the supply, the demand to move across borders and the supply of ways to move across borders, that has empowered unethical smugglers, recruiters, sorry, just smugglers, because I guess if you're a smuggler, you're unethical, right? So unethical smugglers, recruiters, and employers, and that has led to rampant pathologies. 40,000 people have died over the past decade, in transit at least. That's what we can roughly count. When you go across the Asia to Middle East corridor, you often lose, say, a Bangladeshi typically will lose something like 35% of their wages over the course of 3 years to recruiters. And today, despite a lot of efforts over the past 15 years to reduce the cost of remittances, those costs are still around 8%. So if you take that across the nearly $500 billion in remittances, something like $40 billion is lost in the process of transferring money that is earned, hard-earned by migrants. Again, probably women are accounting today for more than half of remittances. They tend to remit more than men. So you're talking about $40 billion that's lost in remittance fees, and that is something like a third of what the total overseas development assistance is today. So these are big numbers. Even when migration takes place within the framework, say, of bilateral agreements, migrants' rights are typically and often neglected, and the international refugee protection system, as we see today unfolding in the Mediterranean, is insufficient. The failure of states to ensure that as much migration as possible occurs in a safe, legal, and morally responsible way harms not only individuals, but also the common good. It undermines trust in government, justice, and the rule of law. It exacerbates inequality at the national and the global levels. It hinders migration policies that help the broader economy, and it abets a pestilent nationalism that has really sharpened discrimination against minorities and racial minorities of all kinds. Such challenges related to migration aren't going to be solved all in one place. they remain primarily the domain of states, who are fiercely guarding their national sovereignty on the issue of migration and on who crosses their borders. But despite this, migration policymaking in most governments, the fact that they have so much responsibility for what happens with migration and immigrant integration has not meant that governments have invested very much in either one. So you have migration is essentially a policy-making backwater in governments. It takes third place behind other issues, security, clearly economic issues. Migration is an afterthought in many ways, except when it comes to, as a response to anti-migrant populism, when governments feel as if they have to become tougher. It's equally clear, though, that governments at the national level can't solve many, if not most, of migration-related challenges and problems unilaterally. They are not on their own able to crack down on the criminal syndicates that have made human smuggling the world's largest illicit trade. It's now larger than even the illicit trade in drugs or arms. In the absence of cooperation, governments cannot create conditions in which labor market supply and demands are met. And many transnational networks of exploitative employers and recruiters remain out of their reach. So until recently, migration debates at the United Nations, when I say recently, about 10 years ago, were acrimonious and polarized. Most developed countries adamantly opposed the notion of the UN saying anything about migration, and most countries of origin, or many countries of origin, felt that migration had to be within the UN's normative embrace. And the result was deadlock. The onset of the financial crisis in 2008 and the subsequent rise of anti-migrant populism, you would have thought, would have made progress at the multilateral level even more elusive. But counterintuitively, while the political toxicity of migration and domestic politics has increased, it has also accelerated progress at other levels of governance. And this is really important to keep in mind. National governments control migration policy, they control integration policy in many instances, but they're not doing very much out of fear. So that has let the playing field open up a little bit for multilateral institutions, even more so for local governments. Cities are playing a much more significant role in migration. I can talk about it at some point. I think it's a very big theme that we'll be seeing, a mega trend over the next generation of migration, responsibility for migration and immigrant integration devolving down to states and cities and regions, and even to individuals. We've been talking recently about private sponsorship programs for refugees, where it's individuals and communities that would actually take the responsibility for bringing refugees over borders, with state consent, of course. So local governments are playing a bigger role, and so are courts. The courts in Europe, for instance, have been very determined over the past decade when it comes to the asylum and refugee system. So things are moving. And at the global level, cooperation has intensified. I'll give you 2-3 examples on that. One is that the growth of the International Organization for Migration has been just spectacularly big. So it was in the year 2001, there were 91 member states of the IOM. Today there's 157. In 2000, there were 1,000 employees of the IOM. Today there are 10,000. And then at the UN level, the international community also managed to overcome the polarization between North and South in 2006 when it created the Global Forum on Migration and Development, which has become the principal place where governments come together in a non-binding way to exchange practices, to foster cooperation, and to create partnership agreements at the bilateral and at other levels. It's also played the Global Forum a really important agenda setting role. For instance, it has enabled the conversation over the past 3 years about migration taking its place in the post-2015 UN Development Agenda. Do I really have 2 minutes left? If I do, I will skip it. And then I would say that the another achievement has been the Domestic Workers Convention, which really could be called the Female Migrant Domestic Workers Convention. But it wasn't, and I think it's a really important point to make, that often you can make a lot of progress when it comes to migration by not naming it as such. So do not put migrant or migration in the name of whatever policy or other goal that you have, and you have a much higher likelihood of success. I don't think the Domestic Workers Convention, which has now been ratified by many European countries who have not ratified the Migrant Workers Convention, I don't think it would have been ratified had it merely referenced migrants at all. So there is, I think, a lot of scope to make progress over the coming years. We're going to see more intensive dialogue at the UN, both at the General Assembly level, which only talked about migration for the first time in 2006. And it had another high-level dialogue, so-called, in 2013. And we'll have another one by 2019, and I think those will become regular. I think you'll see one of two possibilities of either the IOM coming closer to the UN, or the UN developing its own capacity to handle migration over the coming years in a more intensive way. I think all of this will contribute to sounder policymaking, better data and policy analysis, and those will reach larger communities of bureaucrats and stakeholders. It's kind of like a tortoise type approach to progress, because more explosive progress, or through conventions or other major policy initiatives, I think are not so likely. Tell me how much time I have, and I'll give you my most important 2 or 3 points.
Okay, I think we have 5 minutes. I think we're allocating 15 for each speaker.
So, however, I think that you could also, imagine much bigger goals when it comes to migration. For instance, I think that we should, in our lifetime, see the decriminalization of migration-related offenses. There should not be you should not risk going to jail or being in detention for a migration violation. I think that's a not unreasonable goal, but I think it's a generational goal. I think it's 20 years out. In the interim, I think a lot of the activity would, a lot of the progress can be made at the national level and through courts, both at the national and the regional and the international levels. I think the progress that we can make in that respect is fairly modest and insufficient. The problems related to migration are likely to grow in the coming decade, not diminish, especially in the context of anti-migrant sentiment, which, if you think it's bad in the West and the North, it's even worse in the South, and it's just starting there. I mean, that's empirical data. It's not speculation in terms of discrimination and sentiment. I think if you were considering this in broad historical terms, the migration movement, our awareness of what you can do to improve migration outcomes, and the energizing of policy communities, and the creation of constituencies, the grassroots. If you look at that right now when it comes to migration, and you compare it, say, to the environmental movement, I think you compare the environmental movement and the migration movement, and you'd say we're in the 70s, roughly. We're decades out from where the environmental movement has reached when it comes to migration. And that's not a bad thing, but it's something just to be aware of in terms of what the potential is for change. And I think in order for the movement to grow, those who believe migrants deserve greater policy attention and better treatment will need to ensure that migration is understood by the public not as an isolated subject, but one that's linked to far broader social concerns, such as inequality, nationalism, and gender. It's not going to be achieved, I think, by just having migration-related advocacy. I think migration advocates, those who believe that migrants should be treated better, need to work with other constituencies. That has been the bedrock of progress when it comes to labor reforms. What's changed in the treatment of migrant workers in many countries is the result of labor unions having decided that migrants weren't the enemy, but their allies. And they have used their power to be able to champion rights for migrants. And it's sort of obvious. You don't want migrants being paid less or working under conditions that are discriminatory, because that disadvantages native workers. So you can see those kinds of alliances being built over the course of the coming years. And those kinds of alliances have a lot of targets that they can try to achieve. So I'll just list 8 or 10 goals related to migration. It doesn't seem that it should be so hard to reduce remittance costs to close to zero. That will bring $30 to $40 billion into the hands of the world's poorest families. You can lower recruitment costs, which, as I mentioned, can be up to and upwards of a third of wages. Those don't need to be taken by middlemen. There's reasons why. I could analyze them for you, and there are ways to reduce those fees, which it's hard to estimate, but would bring tens of billions more into the hands of the world's poorest families. You can ensure that migrants get to keep their Social Security benefits. At the moment, when you migrate, roughly speaking, only about 20 to 25% of migrants work in a country, go back home, and bring their Social Security benefits, which they have earned, with them. But some countries, like Turkey and Morocco, protect their migrants to the point where 85 to 90% of those migrants bring back their Social Security benefits, their welfare benefits. So it's possible. It's just not being done. So, oh, I saw that, don't worry, 2 minutes. I'm being assaulted on all sides. So, do you want a little 2-minute thing for me too?
So you can arrive to speak about the female migration.
What? I said I wasn't going to speak about female migration. So you can end the detention of migrant children. It's particularly egregious. It's amazing that it's done. In the United States, I think the number is in the thousands, obviously, especially after this summer. But there's